All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Are we all here? I'm a call and response. I'm a Southern woman, so I do like to hear from you when I'm standing in front of you. It's really my pleasure to introduce our panel this afternoon entitled Race and the Political Dynamics of this Marriage Issue. And I am happy to have at the podium with me Professors Nicole, Cathey at Tougaloo College, who is actually my home girl. We're both from Jackson, Mississippi, and she'll be giving a paper entitled Rethinking Civil Rights, Race, Religion, and Same-Sex Marriage in Washington, D.C. And after her, we'll hear from Professor Michelson, who will give a paper entitled It Does Matter If You're Black or White or Brown. After that, we will hear some commenting by Professor Dara Strelovich of Princeton University. And I may kick in a little bit every now and then, too, as the moderator. But mainly my role, as you know, is to keep the time and to keep us flowing. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Cathey, and she will come to the podium.
Thank you for that introduction, and I want to just take the time to thank the organizers for putting this symposium together. I'm thrilled to be here and just in the company of this intellectual community. This is a project that I'm currently still working on. I definitely want your feedback, and hopefully we can have a great exchange here. But what really got me to this particular subject, of course, I wanted to kind of explore the perceptions of justice among the African American church community and the community at large, particularly after the passage of Proposition 8. I really wanted to know what was influencing the political behavior there. Of course, we know that some of the poll data was saying that nearly 70% of African Americans voted for Proposition 8. And so I wanted to know why. Of course, we do know that religious beliefs are definitely a factor, but what else was going on? At the time, I was living in Washington, D.C., and so I thought it was really good to see what was going on there. It was mobilization taking place in Washington, D.C., getting ready to pass same-sex marriage legislation there in 2009. It was an interesting makeup in the city, even though the numbers are definitely changing rapidly, but you have a majority African-American city. African-American mayor signed it into law, and so and definitely the African-American religious community has one that's been active and politically active as well. So what's the problem? What's going on? What we do know that after President Obama, which is our first sitting African-American president, made the endorsement for same-sex marriage, it sent somewhat of an emotional rift throughout the African-American community, particularly among African-American church leaders. There was a question as to whether or not he was moving civil rights, the legacy of civil rights in a way that would be progressive or in a way for African-Americans that would be beneficial, or was this some way to infringe upon the sacred rights of the religious community? And so this is definitely something that as I said, was a problem, and I definitely wanted to look into. Of course, there are gaps in the literature. There's not much information as it relates to the perceptions. Of course, there are numbers that show that African Americans are more likely to vote against same-sex marriage legislation, but there's no literature there as well. Also, there's an intra-community conflict that's taking place. You have those who are opposed to same-sex marriage, clearly. Why are they opposed? First of all, there's a religious divide here. There's some theological issues that are taking place. But also what's going on, too, is that some African Americans feel that the LGBT community should not compare their experience to African Americans. Also, you have those who are in support. They do feel that, listen, this is the next step in the legacy of the civil rights movement. We do support same-sex marriage couples. Frankly, we want to see this move forward. So looking at some of the literature, what I did find, and I won't go through all of the, particularly when we talk about same-sex marriage mobilization in the U.S., we talked a lot about that. We talked about the fact that same-sex couples have been calling for their right to marry since the 60s. We know that the Hawaiian Supreme Court in 93 moved this thing forward. But also, what was important for me to look at was the power of the African American church as a social political institution. We do know that the African American church, also HBCUs, are the strongest institutions within the African American community, and the power of the African American church is significant. Of course, we know that not all African Americans are monolithic. We're not all Christians. However, when it comes to the issue of homosexuality, it does mirror that of the African American church. Another thing that was important to look at was African Americans and the opposition to homosexuality. Why the opposition? Why is the opposition there? One of the things that, of course, we brought up and we know is because of the religious beliefs, but also there has been historical sexual exploitation against black bodies that keep African Americans from even dealing with the idea of sexuality. Also, there's a race survival consciousness that's there within the community. Race survival consciousness. Of course, we know that people were out and open. We're getting information, particularly on Barrett Rustin. He walked with Martin Luther King. He organized the march in Washington. But race has always been at the forefront. Okay? Now, the methodology that I used the mixed method approach. Of course, there was qualitative data, one-on-one interviews, quantitative. I also did online interviews to kind of get to some of my answers. And we're going to move very quickly into the findings and some of the questions there. What I wanted to kind of get to is in what ways are African American leaders and church attendees interpreting civil rights in the U.S.? What factors explains the differences and perspectives of civil rights among African American leadership? What ways do the authoritative structure of the African American church inform ideology on the question of same-sex marriage? And what recommendations do African American leaders have? Now, looking at the interview findings, what I did find is that 82%, and of course, who I was interviewing there in Washington, D.C. was African American church leaders, African American government officials, and organizational leaders. 82% said that it was equality for all. And you have 16% that said it was human rights. So as we can see, African Americans are in favor of civil rights, and they do feel that it's inclusive of all people. From the survey, of course, these were church attendees. You had to be over 18, a member of a predominantly African American church in Washington, D.C. 47% said that it was equality for all, while 23% said that it was human rights, 12% fair treatment under the law. Again, you can see that their interpretation is inclusive of all people. What factors explain the differences in perspectives of civil rights among African American leadership and church attendees regarding the legalization of same-sex marriage? Now, what I got, some of the themes, it was really mixed feelings is what came up. You had those who feel that rights should be granted to all people. As I mentioned earlier, this group feel that same-sex marriage couples should have the right to marry and that, again, this is just the next step in the legacy of civil rights movement. Others felt that it's not biblically supported. They see this strictly as a morality issue, and that, frankly, civil rights is for LGBT people cannot be supported. Also, constraints from constituents. This came from a number of the government officials that I talked to who did not vote for same-sex marriage couples. They felt that they needed to be a voice for their particular community, and they felt that their constituents would not support same-sex marriage legislation. Question 3, in what ways do the authoritative structure of the African American church inform ideology? When talking to African American pastors, two things came up, organizational conflicts and cultural nuances. Organizational conflicts, of course, pastors admitted to there were other discriminatory practices that was taking place that could inform the ideology on same-sex marriage. What came up was a few isms, if you would, sexism, ageism, ableism, things that are taking place that provides these practices within the institutional church. Also, don't ask, don't tell policy is still enforced within African American churches. Now, what type of cultural nuances are influencing this decision? Silence on sexuality. As I mentioned earlier, sexuality is still taboo. It's something that's not discussed, it's not really talked about much. And so there are cultural nuances that influence that. Also, retention of Africanisms. What's retention of Africanisms? Well, in some African cultures, even today, it's deadly to be openly gay. And so, there are some retentions within the culture that to be gay is deadly, and we should not. It should not be a part of the culture. Also, bibliography. Bibliography is the extreme devotion to the literal interpretations of the scriptures. And so those are things that we are up against. Another is, or the last question, if you would, what recommendations do the leadership give in protecting the civil rights of the LGBT community? And the thing is the promotion of LGBT justice. Many believe that we have to begin by simple conversations. We have to have those not only in our churches, but also in our communities and other outlets. There has to be promotion of diversity within and without the walls, and also a support of more liberal theology. So in sum, what we find is that, particularly in Washington, D.C., the attitudes are atypical of other attitudes that we've seen and, of course, read about. African Americans there are more supportive of LGBT rights and same-sex marriage legislation. They remain supportive of civil rights protections of LGBT individuals, crime, housing, and employment. And also those who are hindered by biblical beliefs, limited view of civil rights protections, and the constraints from their constituents. Thank you.
Did you slide it over?
It's on the screen.
It's
That one's yours?
yeah, that one.
There you go.
Cool. All right.
So this paper that I'm writing is with a colleague, Brian Harrison, who's at Wesleyan University, and he is extremely disappointed that he couldn't be here for these 2 days of fun. But he's very much my partner on this project, so I want to make sure everyone knows Brian should be here with me. So we've been working on this paper. It's really part of a larger project. It's a book called Listen, We Need to Talk. And the theory behind the book is that if you activate a shared in-group identity with somebody and then have a conversation with them or even just ask them a question about marriage equality, they're going to be more open to saying that they're a supporter. They're going to be more open to just considering what you have to say because they're feeling this shared identity with you. And we are testing this theory with a variety of experiments. I am an experimenter, and so we create treatment and control groups, and we've been going out and running experiments for the last few years. Most of them have been in cooperation with equality organizations, such as One Iowa, Equality Illinois, Equality Maryland. We're in the field right now with Equality Louisiana. We're talking to Indiana. So we're having a lot of fun talking to people and testing our theories. And hopefully coming soon to a bookshelf near you will be this book. We have a contract, so there will be a book. Might just not have that as the picture. But so I'm just giving you a little bit of our fabulous stuff that we've been doing. So as Nicole mentioned, there are historical gaps in support for marriage equality in terms of all different kinds of groups, but what I'm focusing on here are racial groups and ethnic groups, Latinos and blacks and whites. And as you can see, historically, there are large differences in support. Data on Latino public opinion doesn't go quite as far back, but you can see that whites tend to be much more supportive than African Americans, and Latinos have actually surpassed both groups in terms of their support. And there are a variety of reasons underlying these differences. Nicole talked about some of them. There is the historical position of African American churches and the religiosity of African American communities that explains some of their resistance to supporting marriage equality. There's also actually backlash against the equating of the LGBT rights movement with the civil rights movement. And so, you know, some of the people in this room have written these papers that I cite that we cite in the paper, but that there are all these reasons for it. And we're not worried about that. What we want to know is, how do we move opinion, regardless of whether it's based on religion or distaste for the words that are being used? You know, how can we change the numbers? So first I'm going to talk about a couple of experiments that we did with African American communities. And as we approached this project, we first went in and read up on Black linked fate and group identity. And there's a lot of literature out there that talks about how for blacks, their identity is very much connected to their race, that, you know, there's work by Michael Dawson and Vince Hutchings and, you know, all these scholars of black public opinion basically talking about the fact that race is one of the biggest determinants of black public opinion because they experience the same racialized world. And so for them, their identity as a member of the black community has a huge impact on the way they see the world, and their identity is wrapped up in their race in a way that doesn't really hold for white Americans. And so because the traditional position on marriage equality before Barack Obama finished evolving was one of opposition, the black answer, if you will, to do you support marriage equality was no. And so as a way of signaling and maintaining their identity as a member of the Black community, the default answer for a member of that community would be, no, I don't support that. At the same time, that is reinforced by the predominantly white LGBT community, which tends to exclude African Americans from what they're doing, from their messaging. There was a lot of criticism of the LGBT movement on Prop 8, you might remember. After the vote in California, there was criticism of the way the campaign had been handled and how there had not been sufficient outreach to communities of color. And so that was a reminder of the ways in which they had been traditionally excluded. And then finally, I want to mention work by Cathey Cohen, who argues that supporting LGBT rights, she argues very clearly that supporting LGBT rights threatens a Black individual's sense of belonging and identity with the Black community. So given all of those reasons for not supporting marriage equality, then things change, and Barack Obama evolves, and now there's the possibility that the Black response can be yes, right? So we did a couple of experiments. Let me get to my experiments. So we believe that if we somehow cued a shared in-group identity as a member of the Black community, where the Black answer was, yes, I support marriage equality, we would get respondents more likely to say yes, right? As opposed to a conversation that didn't cue that identity. And so we tested how to activate that identity in two different ways, either by having a quote from a prominent Black elite saying that they're a supporter, or by having a Black person do the asking. So we have randomization on two variables. The script that is used, either just a basic script, are you a supporter? Can I add you to our list of supporters? Or, so-and-so just said this supportive thing. How about you? And then also, is the person making the phone call Black or not Black? So that's our theory, and that will work. So, and then there's the second hypothesis about the interviewer. Right, so the first experiment we did was with Equality, Illinois. And as you can see from the date, we did this in 2011. This is before Barack Obama was a supporter. And so, unfortunately, we couldn't use his quote quite yet. And we actually had a little bit of trouble finding a good quote, but we did eventually find one that we thought would work from Coretta Scott King. And we used Equality, Illinois regular volunteers, and we also recruited some students from the Chicago area because there actually were not a lot of Black volunteers at Equality, Illinois. So we had to have, in order to have variation on the race of our interviewer, we had to hire some local college students. And we talked to 285 people. We made a lot more calls than that, but not everyone got to finish their conversation. We have 285 conversations that we were able to test. And this is a really long and wordy script quote slide that you really don't have to read, but you can just see, we say that we're calling from Equality, Illinois. We identify the call as being from an organization that supports marriage equality, and then we have the quote. And so, of course, the script for the controls didn't have the quote, but otherwise was identical, right? And so we asked people if we could add them to our list of supporters. And it kind of worked, right? It kind of worked on the race of the caller, but not on the script. So do I have laser pointing skills? Here we go. So if you look at, for either script, for the non-Black interviewers, 24.8% of people said that they would add their name to the list of supporters. But if a Black person made the call, then the respondent, 30.9% of respondents said that they would be willing to be added to the list, right? So a big difference. And then if you just looked at the script, these are really pretty close, right? Okay, and those are just the the descriptive statistics, so we did fancier statistics, which is really low on the screen because I didn't know about the setup of this room, but there, it's significant. There you go. So, and using, what do you call this, predictive probabilities, we estimate that being contacted by a black person made a black respondent 12% more likely to say that they would be willing to add their name to the list of supporters, and the script didn't matter. Which in retrospect makes sense because everyone knew that the black answer was no. And so to pull up this kind of supportive quote from Coretta Scott King and have it not work when every other, or very many other prominent black elites are saying no, it just wasn't strong enough, right? But, hooray, Barack Obama changed his mind and said this perfect quote for us to use. It's nice and short. We could throw it into a script and we could try again, right? And so we wanted to try the same thing after Barack Obama has changed his mind. And of course, as we all know, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence this was going to work, right? Because the polls of blacks before and after Obama's announcement made it pretty clear that he was acting as an elite Q for African Americans. Approval for gay marriage jumped in Ohio from 16 to 42%, in North Carolina from 44 to 55%, in Maryland from 41 to 59%. After he made his announcement, black elites from all over started announcing that they were supporters too. Cory Booker, Deval Patrick, Colin Powell, the NAACP, 50 Cent, Will Smith, everybody's getting on board, except for religious leaders, of course, right? Religious leaders are calling on their parishioners to stop supporting the president and are urging them to follow the will of God and not the president. But every other black elite is saying, yes, gay marriage, awesome, let's go for it. So we had to do the experiment again. I also have this adorable picture from Newsweek. Remember that?
Rainbow halo.
Rainbow halo for our first gay president. Okay, so we're getting all these different reactions. We're getting support from black elites. We're getting support from the black public, but we're not getting support from black religious leaders. So we had to try it again. We contacted Georgia Equality and asked if they would partner with us, and they said yes. Almost every group we call says yes. It's really fun to make the phone call. So we worked with them in July through September of 2012. This time we were able to complete 183 conversations. We were able to only use regular Georgia Equality volunteers this time because they do have a diverse group of people that work with them. And as you can see, the opposite thing happened, right? So now the script matters and the race of the interviewer doesn't matter, right? Huge difference here, small difference here, and it's confirmed in the multivariate analysis. We get significant script effect, nothing on interviewer race, and if you are contacted and read the script from Obama, and this is after all the media coverage of it, and yet still working, that you are 10% more likely to say you support gay marriage if you are contacted and read the Obama quote, regardless of the race of the caller. So, yeah.
Can you go back one slide?
This one, or?
No, one more.
Okay. Okay, cool. I'm kind of going fast over all the numbers, but I'll send you the paper if you want to see all the numbers. There are more numbers in the paper. These are the cleaned up, okay, numbers. All right, so we concluded from these two experiments that these sorts of experiments that activate a shared in-group identity either through an elite Q or a race of interviewer Q are very powerful. And that was a way, in fact, to move black opinion on marriage equality. So those of you who know me know that my focus is actually usually on Latino politics. So, of course, the next question is, would this work on Latinos as well, right? Can we replicate this and make it work for a different community? So we tried to get an organization to work with us, and that really didn't work. So we ended up doing an experiment in cooperation with Latino Decisions instead, where we just basically brought questions on a survey. We chose as our elite cue a quote from Dolores Huerta. Again, we were having a little bit of trouble finding a good quote. So the interviews are in a much shorter period of time because this is a professional surveying organization, and we have an N of 800 conversations, 400 with the Q and 400 without. This time we're just manipulating the elite Q. We don't have control over the race of the interviewer or the ethnicity of the interviewer. This is the long, wordy quote slide, but basically signaling this is Dolores Huerta. We were a little bit worried after talking to Gary's business partner, Matt Barreto, that people wouldn't know who Dolores Huerta was, so we tried to boost her up a little bit by saying who she was. You don't have to introduce Barack Obama, but okay, apparently Dolores Huerta is not very well known. And so we tested this script, and it didn't really work exactly as we expected. It worked on US-born Latinos pretty well, but not so much on foreign-born Latinos. We did a follow-up experiment with, no, I didn't do a slide for that. We did a follow-up little mini Google consumer survey experiment. I don't know if any of you have played with those, but they're super fun and cheap and fast. And so we just tested really quickly, do Latinos know who Dolores Huerta is, and does that vary by nativity? And yes, in fact, that's exactly the problem that's showing up here. Foreign-born Latinos didn't know who we were talking about. And US-born Latinos are much more likely to have heard of Dolores Huerta. The other thing we picked up on in our Google consumer survey is that when asked to name, given an open-ended question, who do you consider a Latino leader, she was never named, not by a single person. Not very encouraging, but people did mention Cesar Chavez, Sonia Sotomayor, and Barack Obama, and Marco Rubio, but of course we can't get a Marco Rubio quote. And although it is, it is tempting to mess with people, we didn't want to engage in deception. So we had to do the experiment again. Unfortunately, this data is delayed and I don't have results yet, but this is more exactly replicating the experiments with African Americans. We are manipulating both the ethnicity of the interviewer, Latino or not Latino, and we've expanded the quote, and we added a couple more names to try to make it more clear that Latino elites do support gay marriage. It's a little deceptive because Cesar Chavez did march with LGBT organizations, and he was very much a supporter, and it's pretty freaking obvious that Sonia Sotomayor is a supporter, but there's no quotes, right? So we're using the same quote from Dolores Huerta, was just changing the intro, and that's in the field. So I don't know yet, fingers crossed that this works, and it works for Latinos as well. So I want to also make clear that we're testing lots of identities. We're testing partisanship. We're cueing progressive identity, whether that works. Religious identity, if you're speaking to a religious respondent and you talk to them about support from leaders of their denomination or just from religious leaders, how well does that work? We've tried cueing shared sports fan identities. We went to a Giants game. We did one for the Super Bowl last year. Kind of following up on some organizations' focus on marriage equality as an issue of love and equality, like the Freedom to Marry campaigns. We've tried to talk about families and love as a cue, because everyone loves and a lot of people have families. And all of those are in the book, or going to be in the book, so keep an eye out for the rest of the fabulous details. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll start by thanking Gary for asking me to comment on these great papers, and to the great paper writers and presenters. I should also start with a slight caveat, which is that I actually received Melissa's multiple papers ahead of time, and so I have more extensive comments about that project than about Nicole's where I got slides but had less of a sort of developed sense. So there's a little bit of imbalance, and I apologize for that, although I have new ideas now having listened. So the two presentations are clearly linked in some important ways. They speak to some of the same interesting, am I speaking loud enough? Okay. Same interesting and important questions about race and the political dynamics of same-sex marriage, clearly in some different ways, but both take as their starting points questions about the role of elite influence and the evolving levels of and support for same-sex marriage in communities of color. And each one also, I think, really engages questions about how we might think about both the role of religion and religious institutions, and also the term civil rights, especially in Nicole's paper, when it comes to attitudes towards same-sex marriage and LGBT equality on the part of, and I'll say presumably straight, members of historically marginalized groups. So I'll start with a few words about Nicole's paper, which, as you know, looks specifically at the role of religion and religious leaders. There were a few, actually, I thought, very striking findings in some of the results. First, the major divisions among the leaders that you show, essentially split into thirds among support, oppose, and unsure in terms of attitudes about same-sex marriage. I also really appreciated something you didn't talk a ton about, but that I noted in reading through your slides yesterday, which is the attention to issues of crime policy, housing and job discrimination, and other related issues, in addition to questions about same-sex marriage. These are all issues that, of course, have particular implications for something I'll talk a little bit more about at the end of my comments for intersectionally marginalized queers, particularly low-income, trans, queers of color, et cetera, about which, again, more in a moment. And I also really appreciated the attention at the end of the presentation to some of your recommendations for how we might use some of what you found in thinking about promoting LGBT justice. So I think that's something, again, that you might develop a little bit more. I found Brian and Melissa's papers and presentation similarly exciting and promising, and I say promising in both of these cases, both as parts of research agendas, but also for what they both suggest about the future of LGBT and queer politics and equality. I thought that the presentation that Melissa gave was a really interesting way to use a pretty now standard method in political science, these survey experiments, to really try and gain some purchase on a thorny question about how we might move attitudes, sort of using a kind of cross-sectional design to try to simulate some overtime change, sort of prime support. I had a few questions about how closely this kind of cross-sectional variation that you find in the experiments actually maps onto the kind of change over time that you highlight at the beginning of the papers. I think that the increased support that you and Nicole and others have rightly noted certainly has something to do with the race of interviewer and elite cue giving that you talk about in the real, as they play out in the real world. But it's also, I think, worth thinking about in developing the work about all the other changes that are happening sort of simultaneously, which is always the problem with studying politics that are happening. But I think there are some ways you might think about them, particular ones, and incorporating and perhaps even operationalizing them in the experimental survey designs. So for example, as you note, both the role of race, of interviewer effects, and of elite cue givers are pretty well established in the literature and public opinion. And they play out in interesting ways in your data, but it leads to a pretty, I think, top-down story about political change. And so I also wondered whether you might look to some of the social science literature on contact hypotheses. In this case, about the fact that over the same period that these changes are happening, people's friends, coworkers, family members, et cetera, are also sort of coming out probably in increasing numbers. And I couldn't tell whether you had measures or controls for those kinds of questions in the data or in the results. But it might be interesting to try, at least, especially if you have experiments that are still in the field, to have some questions about, are you close to someone? Do you know someone? And if you could even try to think of a way or figure out a way to again, try to kind of capture the overtime thing by asking, how long have you known, or something like that. That might give some interesting purchase on other factors that are happening, and B, the sort of what changes the attitudes. And I'll say sort of ahead of time, even if you did control for contact, and you still get the same results for interviewer and script effects, it might also still be an interesting, what political scientists call policy feedback story, in which elite cues lead to more openness among people, and then to more acceptance among their friends, relatives, coworkers, etc. All of which in some ways is to say, is there anything happening beyond the top-down story, and can you make it a part of your story? I also wondered if you might consider a third baseline group that was not told that you were calling from an LGBT rights organization, or maybe you've done this in some experiments, or a group that heard no quote in support of same-sex marriage at all. Even just knowing, I think, that the caller is from an LGBT rights organization is probably priming something. And even hearing an anonymous quote and on top of the priming from the rights organization is probably priming some kind of social desirability, at least on the part of some people, or, eliciting reactivity, depending. So I wonder if a sort of blank, a totally neutral version might get some additional purpose. And then, I'm sort of loath to suggest that we should further study white attitudes, and I completely understand that the research in both presentations grows out, in part at least, of interest in why some communities of colors have until recently been less supportive of at least same-sex marriage than whites. But I'm nonetheless going to suggest that it actually would be interesting and perhaps even important to study whiteness in this case. Whites, as racially marked people, and in some ways in both of these research agendas, white attitudes in Melissa and Brian's study, and then possibly even white religious leaders in Nicole's study, in part because I think not doing so makes it easy to exceptionalize and in some ways even sort of pathologize the political attitudes and behavior of people of color by forgetting that actually whites have long been extremely hostile to same-sex marriage, that it's really only recently that you get that bump up to the sort of bare majority of 52%, and even that kind of bounces around depending on what you look at. And that whites, too, get a lot of these attitudes, positive and negative, from their political, religious, and other kinds of leaders, and can be primed or be reactive, etc. It's also worth noting, as Nicole reminded us, that whites actually have exceeded, that African Americans have exceeded whites in support for many other things that are not about same-sex marriage, for anti-discrimination protections in various different ways, for hate crime laws, etc. And so while I don't want to dismiss opposition or support for same-sex marriage as meaningless, I think it's also just useful to remind ourselves, as many people have today, that marriage is a complicated issue, both among LGBT people and between us and our other communities, not just racial, ethnic, or religion, but as Lee pointed out this morning, feminist, general, progressive, etc. And speaking of whiteness, I also want to encourage you to think a little bit about whiteness and the race of interviewer effect, actually. So not just to kind of think of it as the non-finding that you don't have, that's kind of the baseline, but whether in addition to a sort of desirability linked fate effect of Black interviewers or Latino interviewers, we might also think about interpreting, in this case, the effect of white interviewers actually as, so you sort of mentioned reactivity, and that might be one possibility. But the other possibility is actually a different kind of social desirability effect. And what I'm thinking of here is that if it's a common stereotype among whites of African Americans that they're sexually promiscuous, that getting a phone call from a white interviewer might sort of elicit a desirability response, which is to sort of say, no, I know you're from a gay rights organization, I know you want me to sort of support this, but other kinds of social desirability are actually kicking in that are not unrelated to the elite cues, but sort of different than, and again, sort of thinking a little bit about race of interviewer in that way. And then finally, I kept thinking as I read both papers and listened to both presentations, whether you might get a little bit of purchase onto the issues that you're thinking about conceptually and theoretically if you brought a more explicitly intersectional set of questions and frameworks to bear on some of the questions that you're asking. So for Melissa, in a sort of pretty basic, public opinion model level, I know you have a small n, but can you say anything breaking down, if you have any LGBT identified people of color in any of your samples, is there anything there worth talking about? For Nicole, in thinking perhaps about intersectionality as sort of another framework through which some of the leaders you're interviewing might be thinking about civil rights and as a sort of more expansive way of thinking about civil rights. So I will stop there and hope that I can learn more about your research. Again, the papers are wonderful and the presentations as well. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. I'll give you the opportunity to respond to the comments if you'd like, but in the context of the questions that may come from the audience. Now, I have a lot I want to say, but I realize we have 20 minutes. You have first dibs, and then maybe I can slip one in there in a moment. So, questions, comments.
Yeah, for Melissa, this is really exciting. They're really, really great experiments, and I'm sympathetic to it too because I've been doing field experiments trying to persuade people similarly. So I'm looking forward to seeing the working papers that I haven't. I've just seen the Illinois one, and it's out of that and sort of out of some of Dara's comments that I'm interested. So the Logit model in that paper, the race of interviewer effect is really strong, but there's also similar magnitudes for the effects for the orientation of the caller and the gender of the caller, which I thought were pretty interesting, particularly considering that it doesn't look like that script really gave LGBT callers a chance to kind of come out on the phone. So to the extent that, that's something that's a real relationship would be being picked up from vocal inflections or sort of the way the script was delivered. And so sort of piggybacking off of that finding, understanding that those weren't randomized, I was wondering if you could speak, in the broader context of these experiments, even impressionistically, to how you think that the orientation of the people who are doing the asking, their gender, their race, is working together intersectionally in a persuasive way, thinking about contact and those sorts of things.
Yeah, thanks. Those findings don't persist in the Georgia experiment, so although of course the Georgia experiment N is a lot smaller, so we're inclined to, in combination with it not being randomized, not put too much weight on those findings. And the research on, I believe the technical term is auditory gaydar, shows that it's actually pretty weak. And so while it's possible that, what I think is the most likely explanation is that in Illinois, a couple of their volunteers were just extremely good at having those conversations, and maybe they happened to be the gay callers. It's hard to say. Without another experiment supporting those. But it's, and also all the interviewer effect literature suggests that while people can pick up on race, they don't, right? That they don't pick up on orientation. So it'd be interesting to come out and do that experiment, but I don't know if you read Brian and my paper on the One Iowa experiment, and where we really, and in that paper, for those of you who are not familiar with my published works, we did randomly assign half of the callers to come out during the call, and they were less persuasive. So we attributed that to the TMI, all that stuff.
Were the
So
callers actually gay?
yes, they were not. They were not engaging in deception, but.
We're just really bad at persuading people.
But we did a fundraising experiment with One Iowa, and the randomization was coming out or not, and the ones who came out were less. So if it worked one way in Iowa and one way in Illinois, I don't know.
Yeah, it was just the intersectional part of it was just really intriguing to me, though, right? If we're doing a sample of the whole population, maybe coming out is less effective, but in certain subpopulations, I think it's really generative ideas of how we can use contact on particular groups.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to test if the caller is black, randomly assigning them to come out or not come out during the call, and then does it work differently in the black community or the Latino community? Or that'd be interesting. Maybe just not in Iowa.
Here.
I know I asked too many questions. I have a question for each paper. For Melissa, it's just really kind of a suggestion, which is looking at, the reason I asked you to go back to that slide is, it's true that race of interviewer effect appears to be greater than script, but in fact, the race of interviewer effect in the first experiment in Illinois only occurred on the Coretta Scott King script. That's where all the effect comes from. And so I'm wondering if maybe they're interacting. You get a similar effect in Georgia, because in Georgia, again, you say the script matters, which is true, but the big difference in the script is only from black interviewers, not from non-black interviewers. And so I'm starting to think that maybe there's an effect where a non-African American who attempts to evoke an African American icon actually gets pushed back on, and that's offensive, and it might be. So that's just a possibility to sort of think through. And to Nicole, could you help? I want to understand if any of the people you talked to, any of the elites, particularly the government officials and the ministers, mentioned the president. And did these interviews occur all before the president came out as a marriage supporter, or after, or where in the timeline?
This was before the announcement, and so I really can't speak. So it was really not a discussion in the interviews at all. Okay.
This is a little bit of a follow-up. I mean, I'm curious about in D.C. whether these interviews were all kind of after the debate about opening up marriage to same-sex couples, or
It was during the.
It was during the debate.
During the debates, yeah. Right, and after.
What's the time period exactly of it?
2009. This was after Prop 8. I started my interviewing, but from 2009 to 10.
Well, I guess I was just going to propose a follow-up study, now that it's been reality for a while, and wondering kind of what the interactions have been with different congregations, maybe with same-sex couples who've asked to be married, or people in the congregations who got married, if not necessarily in the church, that sort of thing. It might, I don't know, you guys might know if people have been studying this sort of thing, but my sense is from living through this in Massachusetts is that people change, and sometimes it happens really fast, so. Be interesting to know.
I'll take a look.
So I have a question. It picks up on sort of the tail end of Dara's comments, but I guess I want to push a little bit harder on it. And it's the notion of, so both the presentations or papers in some way kind of take a departure point of black deviation / black pathology, right? And I guess my question is, sort of what, given the design and research, what's sort of the support for those claims, right? Because I can imagine that the relationship between white church leaders and white church attendees might follow very similar mechanisms. So the notion that this is somehow a black thing is actually inaccurate. Similarly with the sort of potential effect of script or race of question asker, right? Like, So I guess to the extent that, the claims are sort of being made as sort of Black exceptionalism, to what extent, obviously it seems like there's some sort of a theoretical comparison group, but I guess I want to hear a little bit about how you think these processes might work in white contexts.
Do you want to answer first?
Well, I think they will be similar. I was not trying to just make it a Black thing. I was just trying to get at some of the answers after the Proposition 8 passed. African Americans, Black and brown people were pretty much blamed for the passage of that. So and since it was going on in D.C. at the time, I just wanted to ask the questions there in D.C. I was not trying to make it exclusively a Black thing. So I'm sure the same results will come out in white congregations as well.
So the theory of the book is that you can move people if you activate a shared identity, and race and ethnicity is a powerful identity. But we're not signaling out race because we're also activating support for the San Francisco Giants as an identity. We're activating, do you consider yourself a progressive as an identity? And so, in fact, most of our experiments are not about race. Those are the ones that Gary thought would be interesting for this symposium, but most of our experiments, it's just, what's an important identity to people? And if we activate that identity, what effect does that have? So we know from the literature that African Americans have a strong Black identity, right? We know that sports fans tend to have a very strong identity with their team. We know that people who are very religious consider that one of their core identities, right? So if you ask somebody, tell me, who you are and, what kind of person you are, that these identities come out. And so we're actually saying that racial identity is one of these sorts of core identities that people have, that by activating them, you can open somebody up to a conversation.
So if I could just interject here, because I want to come in with a social psychological perspective. If we're talking about identity, the social psychologists on race talk about the various components that are constitutive of identity. And there's what's salient to your identity, what's central to your identity, and also what are the kind of ideological determinants of identity. And so I want to flip this conversation away from the intra-group focus to more of a structural cultural analysis and see how the framing might differ. Because this is what came up for me. Let's think about this thing from the perspective of what are the controlling images in the media and various social institutions of what it means to be LGBT in this society. It's very rare that people of color are actually going to see people of color in those dominant images. So for that to be salient in their identity as something that's a part of them, would be hard to make. Well, first of all, for that to be salient, you'd have to have those dominant images for them to see that is like me, that is of me. Even though there are people who are LGBT. The sociologist Mignon Ward, and she's actually my house guest this weekend, who's written a book called Invisible Families on Black lesbian families, has said to me, she says, even when you talk to Black people, Nicole, who are not religious, they will invoke a religious stance or something. They will actually talk about same-sex marriage in the same way that people of the church do. And that is partly because there's something that's become a part of the script of what it means to be Black based on the dominant or controlling images outside of them. That's what's in popular culture. That's what is in pictures and magazines. That's what are in these television shows that have now made it really cool and popular and chic to be lesbian or gay, but they are not Black and brown faces. So it doesn't become salient in an identity. And so what social psychologists will tell us is that you have to think about what are the things that shape identity as well. And this is one of the things that came up for me. The second thing I want to ask in terms of identity, and this may be controversial, it is not to make it deviant, but I think it is something that is real that goes to your racial survival comment, perhaps. And that is what Goffman talks about stigma. The church is a social space of respectability. per se, right? In some ways. And there have been arguments to say that the association of, I mean, in terms of the church grappling, in terms of African American communities, particularly historically, grappling with where they find a sense of respect, a high sense of esteem or something. The church, the morality, ethics, if you will, the church is the one space in this society that gives them that kind of being at the top of the social hierarchy. Materially, African Americans and other brown people are not in terms of socioeconomics, wealth, all of those kinds of things. So it becomes this complex contextual thing, right, that we map onto these black and brown bodies to figure out what becomes central and what becomes salient in some ways. So I wonder if part of the problem, to go to my first point, and I just put it out there, is that the controlling images for many people of color historically of LGBT people and communities and issues have been white, to get to your whiteness issue. And black folks are distrustful of whiteness and racial inequality and racism, and we never really close that divide. So this is another consequence of a structural political issue, as opposed to thinking about it's a black cultural thing. Because there are a lot of black queer people too, right? There are a lot of people who actually, as you show in your data, who actually support equality for all. But what gets salient is that which they experience when they walk outside every day. People don't see my sexuality. They see my black skin first. That's what you're treated on. So I wonder, and I was trying to think about methodologically, Barack Obama or your elites make the script salient. They make the identity salient, perhaps. But what if you put popular cultural people in there like Jay-Z or Beyonce or something like that? The more we see that, would we see? It's a visibility, it's a salience issue. So that's one thing. And I'm just grappling and wondering about this issue of salience to identity. If you're going to use identity, or the centrality to one's life, is you're going to use identity as a central marker. And also the issue about identity and stigma and respectability too. I think these are really big issues in the community when there's so few things that allow or afford African Americans the opportunity to be seen as the respectable peoples. I just wanted to put that on the table. I hope I wasn't too, that's a lot to say, but I'm just curious to your response to that. I'm a sociologist. I'm not a political scientist, so I've obviously framed this differently.
I think I would like to have a longer conversation with you since it's 2 minutes to 5. But I think it would definitely be interesting to test, for example, what if we had used a quote from 50 Cent instead of Barack Obama? But at the same time, as I mentioned, when Obama made his announcement, a lot of entertainers came out in support. And so it wasn't just Barack Obama, it was black elites from all over the cultural spectrum. And so I think that's why we saw such large shifts in public opinion. It wasn't that Barack Obama said it and the rest of the black community said, whoa, hold on there, crazy person. The rest of the black community, except for religious leaders, said, yeah, me too. We support gay marriage as well. And so that changed the culture and changed the way that blacks were experiencing the issue of marriage equality, so that it wasn't just the president.
And that would be parallel to the white community of other communities, because there's a religious segment in white, so there's variability. Whiteness is given variability. Blackness is often not given afforded that opportunity. So you're right, but it's once again the salience and the identity. I see people like me. I have family members. I have celebrities out there. There's historically been more of that for whites. There's not been that for African Americans. Professor Ali.
How you doing? Really appreciating this conversation, and thank you, Professor Carter, for those comments, and thank you to Dara for those comments on whiteness. I want to push it a little bit further because I think I come from the same sort of broader lens in thinking about these issues, and in just being at the conference for a number of days and thinking about them. I do want people to maybe say a little bit more about the role of whiteness in particular. Because with Prudence's comments, thinking about how whiteness generally operates just in larger society, right? and how there's a similarity within how whiteness operates within the LGBT community. I'm wondering, in your research, do you find LGBT communities, particularly mainstream LGBT communities, dealing with whiteness in an interesting way? And this is an important question to me because strategically, it seems that whiteness may be the elephant in the room when it comes to mainstream LGBT conversations, in a way that your research shows that if whiteness is sort of acknowledged and the sort of predominant sense of race within communities of color can actually impact support, it seems that acknowledging whiteness and white privilege within LGBT community might actually be the most strategically beneficial for the mainstream community, even more than folks even see oftentimes. So whenever you bring up race or people of color in this conversation, it's sort of easily sort of, oh, we can brush that off or we can move beyond that. This is about sexuality. But I think deeply engaging it and addressing it is actually strategically beneficial. And that's sort of what your research is leading us to. And so I'm wondering if you're encountering that or what you think about that.
What I'm encountering is that groups that Brian and I are talking to are extremely interested in expanding their base of support to include more people of color and are pretty clueless about how, which is why they're asking us to help them. But what we are telling them, is that they need to include more Black voices in their outreach and to make the LGBT movement be multiracial and multi-ethnic, and that will bring in the support, and so that they can't just push for people to support them because it's a civil rights issue, but that they have to talk about that they have to have Black people working with them. They have to have Black volunteers. That they have
to take issues of race seriously, though, right? I mean, there's the sort. I mean, I think there's a reaction to a kind of symbolic inclusion model, diversity model, and I think some organizations have tried to greater or lesser success to address issues of race and income inequality and other things on, in addition, right, to trying to get people to show up at their events and then not ask them what they care about or do anything in response to that.
Actually, start with a little bit of a comment. You all are all probably familiar with the movie about the work they did around the marriage amendment in Maryland. But I think the points that are made in that are excellent places to start from research. Although I also want to say that I think to a large extent the elephant in the room is that we haven't dealt with the racism in the LGBT movement, and that if we don't deal with that, then it's not surprising that we have problems with the movement being viewed as something about white people. And we need to deal with that. And I think one of the issues in terms of who is a credible communicator, which is some of what I study, is who actually matters to people. And one of the things is relationship. And I think you're trying to tap that, but tapping it in ways that maybe don't capture the sort of local social culture that is really where relationships largely operate. And then just the other sort of point about the messaging that I think is really excellent in the movie about Maryland is that the leadership of that effort had Black people from the start. And the conversations were consciously, patterned based on the input of the community about what were the messages that worked. And it's amazing that if you ask people what messages they listen to, and then you respond to that they actually listen to your message. It's one of those tautologies. And I think we ought to look at that a little more seriously. Just like the change from talking about marriage equality instead of talking about same-sex marriage. Because if you're talking about equality, that message resonates with people who passionately care about the effects of inequality. Whereas when you get into same-sex marriage, then you get into the images of who is in the dominant culture around same-sex relationships. And that.
Although some people, apparently, when you see marriage equality, they think it means the man and the wife are equal. So we have to be a little bit careful when we say marriage equality, but they know we are actually talking about same-sex marriage.
Well, actually,
it doesn't always work to use that phrase because then people.
Panelists suggested, or suggested in the discussion on discrimination, that might be an equally useful thing for people to grapple with.
Advancing a different kind of justice.
Yeah. So we are out of time, I'm told, and this could go on, and it's too bad that we didn't have more time. But do you want to be the last one to speak?
Please join me in thanking
Yes,
Prudence.
thank you.